No problem. Any questions? Okay, any questions about the speech overlay with regard to speech production and speech perception? So what I'll do is just review this part. Everything else is really about memorization, but in order for a person to initiate speech, then the speech organ responsible for that initiation is the nervous system. And the process that it goes through in order to initiate speech is to conduct output processing, which is part of central processing. So your nervous system is formulating the language, but then also using other neurological components to plan what anatomical parts will be involved and the manner in which they will move to execute speech. So the process is central processing, the speech organ is the nervous system, and its function is to formulate language, and this is with regard to production, formulate language, and send information encoding to other parts of the brain that then send out commands for your respiratory system to breathe for the purpose of speech, for your muscles of your larynx to move, for the articulators of your vocal tract to move in order to filter the sound. And so you start off with formulating speech and encoding in the nervous system. And so a signal is sent to the muscles of the lungs to contract for inhalation, but we speak on exhalation. And the function of the lungs in speech production is to provide power by using exhalation of carbon dioxide as an air compressor. And this process is called respiration or respiratory system. Once the lungs expel carbon dioxide, like an air compressor, it then generates sound by setting the vocal folds into vibration. The speech organ is the larynx. The vocal folds rest within the larynx. And the process of the vocal folds vibrating and producing a sound or generating a sound is called phonation. That sound is then transmitted through the vocal tract. The vocal tract comprises of your throat or your pharynx, your oral cavity, and your nasal cavity. And the purpose of your vocal tract is to then filter the sound that was produced by your larynx into specific speech sounds. And so the speech sounds are moded or filtered due to resonant cavities within the vocal tract. And that process is called articulation. And when that process is complete, then you are then speaking the utterance that was formulated by your nervous system. Well, the power comes from your lungs. The diaphragm is responsible for helping your lungs to force carbon dioxide out. So when you exhale, your diaphragm rises to help compress the lungs to force the carbon dioxide out. When you are inhaling, your diaphragm moves lower allowing your lungs to expand for the oxygen that you're inhaling. So technically the diaphragm is one of the muscles that are involved in inhalation, exhalation, with regard to the, so you have to inhale the oxygen in order to exhale the carbon dioxide. So the diaphragm is just one of many respiratory muscles that allow you to do that. So it is not as though the diaphragm is the first muscle to move. And when we get to that chapter, we'll talk about several muscles that are responsible for helping you inhale oxygen and responsible for helping you to expel carbon dioxide by compressing the lungs, forcing the carbon dioxide out. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, if you have a microphone, it may be faster, easier for you to express it using a mic. And you can just click on. Yes, Susan.
Is there an order of this sort of speech overlay circle? Like, should it start with the nervous system and then progress through? Or does it start with the mind?
It starts with the nervous system by formulating. And so that's why the arrow. So it starts with the nervous system, formulating the language, and then sending the commands to the respiratory system. The respiratory system then generates the power for the phonatory system. So it follows the arrows all the way back to the nervous system, which is responsible for now decoding the message that was received by the listener via the auditory system. So the order is in the direction that the arrows of the circles are going.
And it starts and ends with the nervous system?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Lauren. Okay. And so for the remainder of the semester, after we finish acoustics, we are going to, that's the order in which, well, not really, the order in which we will study speech production. Your book chooses to put the nervous system at the end. And so we will talk about formulation and encoding at the end. Your book then starts with the respiratory system, and we're assuming that at that point that commands have been sent from the nervous system to to respiratory muscles in order to initiate respiration. And then we'll move on to phonation, to articulation, and to the auditory system and study the anatomy and physiology. At the end of the book, it talks about all of the functions of the nervous system, encoding and decoding. And it breaks it down between the basic neurological parts, and then specifically talks about the peripheral nervous system and then later the central nervous system. I'm not sure. Let me see. And yeah, I'm not. I think we listened to that before. So are there? So on the test, it will ask you, what is the speech process for the vocal tract, and you will say articulation. Or it may ask, what organ is responsible for the speech process of articulation, and you will say the vocal tract. Okay, does everyone? Okay, great. This particular slide you don't have to worry about studying. And so this slide talks about speech perception. So everything else talked about how to formulate the language of an utterance and then how to produce it. Now the listener in turn must receive speech. So it's the ear's function is speech reception or detection, and it transmits the acoustical information that has been uttered and transmits that to the nervous system for decoding. And so the process of receiving speech by the speech organ, the ear, is called audition. Okay, questions about the preface before we move on to acoustics? Okay, let me try to load the acoustics PowerPoint. Okay, so the preface is chapter 1. Acoustics is actually chapter 8. And so when I'm, in order to understand speech production or even speech reception, we need to understand basic information about sound. And I think what I'm going to do, which is teach this on the graduate level, is to just switch this to sharing my desktop. Because the PowerPoint actually has animation. And it won't let me cancel. Okay, folks, hold on just a second to see if I can. Okay, go back to sharing and okay, are you able to see the slides, the PowerPoint? Nope. Okay. Let's try again. Are you able to see it now? Okay, great. Now, I will check in periodically when I'm in the presentation mode. I won't be able to see your chat, but I certainly can hear you if you want to use your microphone. But I'll try to periodically come out of presentation mode to see. Okay. Okay, so sound is the study, or acoustics is the study of sound. And we can't see sound with the naked eye. There's really no physical substance, there's no mass there. In order to create sound, there must be a disturbance created by a medium, which will then cause let me start again. Sound is a disturbance through a medium, which is air, and that disturbance is created by a vibratory source. For this particular image, the vibratory source is the tuning fork. When the tuning fork vibrates back and forth, it is disturbing air molecules, and air molecules is the medium, or air molecules are the medium. And disturbance is audible. We can hear it. We can name the disturbance where air molecules are forced to move by calling them waves. And the vibratory source for speech, in order to create an audible disturbance, are created by our vocal folds. the simplest sound that we can refer to as a pure tone. But the pure tone really has nothing to do directly with the production or the reception of speech. Now let's see what this is. Are you able to see the video? No video. Okie dokie. Okay, hold on just a second. Are you able to see the video now?
We can, but it's pixelated.
I'm sorry, it's what?
It's pixelated, or it's just like there's a lag on it that's not making it really clear.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna let you guys look at that at some point. Let's see. I can go back to the PowerPoint and get out of. Okay. Hold on. Okay, are we back to the PowerPoint? Are you able to see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. Sound, the type of tones or sound that we use to produce and to receive speech is called complex tone. So a pure tone is just one frequency. Our perception of that would be pitch. So for speech, there are multiple frequencies, thousands of frequencies that are generated by the vocal folds, modified within the vocal tract, and we call those complex tones. Let's go back to a vibratory source that's been set into motion by some type of force. And so with the tuning fork that you saw that's moving back and forth, it generates air disturbance by compressing air molecules when the pressure is high of the vibratory source. When the pressure becomes low as the, let's say, tuning fork moves back, pressure becomes low and those air molecules are allowed to kind of spread apart. But then as the tuning fork moves forward again, pressure is high and the air molecules come back together. One repetition of increased power and compression, reduction in power, rarefaction, or whether air molecules are allowed to move apart, is called a cycle. And so for each vibratory cycle where the tuning fork is moving forward and back, we count these cycles per second. So the total number of cycles per second is called frequency. So if the tuning fork moves forward and back, it will create a wave. That wave will have a period of compression when the pressure is high by the tuning fork, let's say moving forward, pushing air molecules together. As the tuning fork vibrates and moves backward, the air molecules, there's less pressure on that disturbance, and the air molecules are allowed to kind of drift apart. That's called a period of compression and rarefaction. That makes up one cycle of sound, or it creates one frequency of sound. And frequency's unit of measure is hertz. So when a vibratory source kind of moves back and forth in a fixed number repetitive times, that's called simple harmonic motion. And so if we go back up with the tuning fork moving backward and forward with a certain repetitiveness, that's called simple harmonic motion. In order for a source to vibrate, it must be elastic, meaning that when it's set into vibration, no matter how far it's moved or displaced from its original position of rest, it must be able to return to that position of rest. So the source must be elastic. If we could visualize that audible disturbance through the air, the median, it would look something like this. And so compression is when the air molecules are being pushed together, bumped together because of high pressure. When the vibratory source is moving back to its point of original point of rest, pressure is low. The air molecules are allowed to move apart, and that's a period of rarefaction. One period of compression, one period of rarefaction is considered one cycle. Now, what you see above A, B, and C is called a sine wave, and that is a visual depiction of an oscillating body, or a body that's vibrating back and forth. And it is depicting the number of cycles per second. The line running through the waves, or the cycle, is time. So if you can imagine a bucket with a hole, there's ink in the bucket. And so you start to apply pressure to the bucket. It has a string, and it's going to vibrate or oscillate back and forth. If you begin to walk with the bucket, it will draw this depiction. It will draw a wave, a sine wave. And so a sine wave is a visual depiction of the periods of compression or rarefaction. It is a visual depiction of a cycle, a visual depiction of frequency. And we can then analyze the sound by looking at or measuring the frequency of a sound or the intensity of the sound. Let me come out. Questions? Yes.
Hi, can you explain, I think I understand compression. Can you explain, and I'm looking at that slide number 4 still, Can you explain B and C and what rarefaction is? Because it seems like compression is when the air molecules are moving, but then the definition of rarefaction on this slide also says the air molecules are moving. So what is the difference between the two when they move?
Okay, so instead of thinking about a tuning fork moving, let's think about a swing. Okay, so when you're swinging, you're sitting in a swing, force must be applied to you in order to force you from your position of rest. And so when high pressure is applied to you on the swing, you're going to move forward. And what you can't see is that as you're moving, you're pushing air molecules, compressing them together. When you get to your maximum point of displacement where the swing stops and then attempts to return back to the position of rest, there's low pressure. There's no one pushing you back. And so those air molecules are allowed to kind of separate because of low pressure. They're not being compressed anymore because additional pressure is not being exerted. And so if you're looking at the picture, I don't know if you can see can you see my cursor? Okay, so this would be, so this is the period of compression where the air molecules are moved together. As your swing is coming back with lower pressure, air molecules are allowed to move apart. You can also think of it when you were in grade school and you're in line, and let's say someone pushed, the person from the back pushed the person in front of them. And so high pressure is being applied and people in front of him are being compressed together. But once that pressure is released, people are allowed to move back to their original point of rest. And so that would be a period of rarefaction. With regard to the differences between A, B, and C is a matter of the amount of pressure being applied. So what we're looking at is a difference in how far the vibratory source moves during a period of compression and rarefaction. So if you want it to be pushed on the swing further, then your swing is going to move to a higher amplitude. And so your period of, and so when you return back to your point of rest, you're going to pass your point of rest and come back. But the amount of force depends on how far you're moving that vibratory source from rest. That is called amplitude. And so the peaks are actually going to be higher, indicating an increase in amplitude, an increase in force. And that is analyzed as intensity of the frequency or of the sound. Our perception of intensity is loudness. So the difference that you're seeing, B has a lower amplitude because from its position of rest to the maximum point or to the top of the wave is smaller than C, the position of rest to the top of the wave, which is amplitude. You also see different numbers of cycles. A has 1, and we can count the periods of compression. 1, 2, 3. Let's get this to stop. 1, 2, 3, 4 periods of compression. 1, 2, 3, 4, really 3.5 periods of rarefaction. So we have 1, 2, 3 complete cycles per second, or 3 hertz. B, we have 1, 2, 3, the same number of cycles per second, just at a lower amplitude. C, we have actually more periods of compression and rarefaction, or more cycles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that would be 7 hertz. So that's the difference between A, B, and C. To relate it to a swing analogy, for A and B, the swing moved up, back past the point of rest, back to the point of rest, 1 cycle. And it did it 3 times, 3.5 times. C, the swing vibrated 7 times, 7 sets of compression and rarefaction. Compression, rarefaction 1, compression, rarefaction 2, and on, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and really a half. Yes?
So rarefaction in the swing analogy is when you're swinging, when you reach the top and you're on your way back.
Yes.
That's the back to where you started. That is the rarefaction.
So rarefaction is you're coming back because of inertia, not because of high pressure.
Got it. And so when you pass the point, in that same analogy, if you were to pass the point of where you started, you know, when you kind of go backwards even further, is that also rarefaction, or is that kind of not relevant to this analogy?
No, that's still rarefaction. So if we were looking at, you're going up, then back, past, and the distance that you travel from the point of rest during the point of compression will be the same distance that you will travel from the maximum point of displacement as you move past the point of rest and back again. So
just a quick summary, it seems like the main difference between compression and rarefaction is force versus inertia.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
Visualizing these, assuming that these were the same length of time for each A, B, and C, would it be safe to say that C is a higher pitch because of the increased frequency?
You may or may not perceive it as being higher in pitch, because pitch is just a perception. Frequency is a physical measure of the compression. So let's say that, and at 7 hertz, the human brain really can't perceive 7 hertz. We can only perceive down to 20 hertz. But let's say that I introduced a 1,000 hertz sound to you and a 1,000 hertz sound to someone else. You may judge that sound to be low in pitch. The second person may judge that sound to be high in pitch. But if I were to physically analyze the number, how much pressure was applied, how many cycles per second, then I could tell you what the frequency is for both. So the frequency would remain the same. Pitch is just a judgment of the frequency. So the same with intensity or amplitude. I can introduce a tone to you and a tone to someone else. You may judge it to be different in loudness, but we can physically analyze the amount of pressure applied to increase, to determine the amplitude, and then analyze it in decibel. So we can say, well, both sounds were 50 decibel. but your perception between the two may be completely different. So everything that we're talking about in terms of being able to use an instrument to analyze sound, whether it is an oscilloscope or a sound level meter, or and actually there are apps that you can do this with. We can physically measure the pressure that's applied, the high pressure and the low pressure. We can physically measure that and determine what the frequency of the sound is. We can determine how much pressure was applied with regard to intensity. And we can physically do that with equipment or instrumentation. But pitch and loudness is just pure psychological or perception. It's perception, it's judgment. So I want you as students to understand that they're not interchangeable when we're talking about the analysis, the physical analysis. But when you don't have equipment or don't have instrumentation that can give you the specific physical measures of sound, the only thing that you can use is your perception, your psychological judgment of what you hear. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else before we move on? Okay. Okay, so when air molecules move apart and create low pressure, then the cycle is said to be in a period of compression, refraction, rarefaction, or emittance. Anybody? Yes.
Rarefaction.
Okay, great. Let's see. Go back to the polling and yeah, and so you should see 4 options now. Okay, let's go down to the swing analogy. Okay, so we have an oscillating body, we have a pendulum, and this is your position of rest. And so the pendulum has been set into vibration by a force, and it moves from the point of rest to its maximum point of displacement before it returns back past the point of rest, period of rarefaction, and then returns. That would be one cycle. Now, when force is applied, when this is at its point of rest and not oscillating, there is maximum velocity. So if we're back to a human swing analogy, when the person pushes you and you move forward, then you're moving, the velocity is high, okay, so you're moving faster. When you get to the period where you momentarily stop, so you get to your maximum point of displacement, you get to the point where the swing moves the furthest and stops. There's no velocity at that time, that millisecond, there's no velocity. Now, the distance between the position of rest and that maximum point of displacement, or for us in visualizing that, would be how high the swing moved, would be amplitude. And so the more pressure applied to us as we swing, the greater the amplitude, the further we will move. The time that it takes for one cycle to complete itself is called its period. Questions? Like attack and decay of a musical instrument. Attack meaning the beginning of the sound, and decay meaning the ending of it. Yes, that would be its period. Now, that would be its period in an anechoic chamber. And an anechoic chamber is a room that's been built where there are no hard surfaces, because decay can continue if the sound bounces off of a wall, right? And it continues. So, but what we're looking at right now doesn't include any reverberation, so there really isn't a decay. So it's an attack and then it dies. There isn't like a period of decay. Does that make sense? Okay, so the time that it takes, Ms. Pugh, for, let's say that you're sitting on a swing and someone pushes you, the time that it takes for you to swing up, back past your period of rest, and then back to your period of rest and stop is the period. So that could take milliseconds. Okay. To complete a cycle. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Are there any other questions about this? No, the period is just the time. So if I had a stopwatch and I time the movement of the swing, if I time the period of compression and the period of compression, rarefaction and compression for one cycle, if I started a stopwatch and then stopped it, that's what the period is. Okay. Okay, so the image to the left is what I tried to illustrate before. Our ability to illustrate or to depict an oscillating body, or to depict cycles per second, or to depict periods of compression and rarefaction. And we have instrumentation that can do this for us. And so the image to the right talks about, if this is our, go back up. Okay. So if this is our period of, let's say we start here, and this time we're swinging in the opposite direction. So someone pushes us and we go back, right? And so there's maximum pressure. There's maximum velocity. And then where we come to our maximum point of displacement before the swing stops and swing back, there's minimum velocity or no velocity. There's really no movement for that millisecond. Okay. And for pressure to then This is so extremely sensitive. Okay. So when you have pressure returning, you have when you have the swing returning, coming back, you have maximum velocity again because it is moving. But it's minimum pressure because it's really inertia that's bringing you back. Okay, so are we clear with, yes?
Okay, on that previous slide, when you were trying to parallel the swinging with the right diagram, where is the swing at rest when you just sit on it at the top left?
At the top left.
Where it says minimum velocity, maximum pressure.
Okay.
At the top.
What if this is going to, oh, it does. Okay. I'm going to draw my own. Can you see this?
Yeah, I can.
What I'm drawing? Okay. So let's say that we're going to call this spot, come on, the point of rest. Okay, so we're not going to look at this one because it starts at a weird place. Okay, so let's start at 0 degrees azimuth. And so you're on a swing.
You're sitting on the swing.
You're sitting on the swing at the X.
Not even moving, just sitting there. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so then someone pushes you, and you begin to move. And that's maximum velocity because you're moving. Okay, then there's a moment before where you go out, that brief second before you start to come back. That's the maximum point of displacement. And there's no velocity there. You're not moving for that brief second, right?
Right.
Okay, so the swing comes back, past the point of rest, until you reach the point of maximum displacement going the other way. And for that brief millisecond, there's no velocity because you're not moving. And then because of inertia, you come back to the point of rest. So you have a period of compression, a period of rarefaction, and that is one cycle.
Oh, okay.
Now the time that it takes for that to happen from the point of rest, to, let's see if I can get this to work, to the other point of rest would be its period. Question.
So when you say from the point of rest to the other point of rest, are you talking about this whole, I'm pointing to it on my screen, but that doesn't help, the whole kind of cycle that you're showing here, or is it just the top mound or just the bottom mound?
So if you are on a swing and you swing forward, you swing back, and as you come back to where you started, someone stops you, right? So you don't start again. Another period of compression. That is one cycle.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Get out of this. Let me see. Okay. Questions? Okay. So far, what I've depicted to you is a pure tone. There's only one frequency. It's only showing you one drawing of cycles per second. So that's just one sound. The minimum velocity is at the point of maximum displacement. So it's at that millisecond where you stop, or where the pendulum stops before it moves back the other way. Okay. So, okay. So now, so far we've talked about frequency, the number of cycles per second, the number of periods of compression and rarefaction. And frequency, if you can think about frequency, we can measure frequency. We can measure the pressure, the increase in pressure, decrease in pressure. And it's measured in hertz, right? So we can say that this particular sine wave has period of compression, period of rarefaction, and it stops. Another period, and it stops. Another period of compression and rarefaction stops. So that's 3. So that would be 3 hertz, or the frequency would be 3. Now, this sine wave and this sine wave appear to have the same number of cycles per second. 1, 2, that's supposed to be another color. Let's try it. 2. 3. It's supposed to be another one. So we have, again, 3 hertz. So what is the difference between 1, 2, and 3? It really has to do with, oh, this is crazy. Go back, where am I? Is the distance from the point of rest to the maximum point of displacement. So if this is the point of rest, from here to there is how far the pendulum swung, how far your swing moved, and that is the amplitude of a signal. It corresponds to the power or the amount of pressure being placed to move the pendulum or to move you on a swing. And so amplitude represents a sound's intensity. And we can measure the amplitude, so this would have a greater amplitude than this wave or this one. So the unit of measure is decibel. And so this would have a higher decibel reading than the first sine wave. Our perception of amplitude or intensity is loudness. So if these 3 sine waves were played for you, you may perceive one to be louder than the other, but that's not a physical measure. That's just a psychological judgment. Yes?
Could an analogy be made of, let's say you're looking at the ocean and the waves kind of crash as they hit the beach because they get higher and crash as they hit the beach because they have nowhere else to go. So the waves, I think, get shorter, and it would be much louder if you're sitting on the beach than if you were on a boat, 500 feet out into the water, because you don't have those waves crashing. Are those waves that kind of get high as they reach the beach? Would those, in this analogy, be like the amplitude of those waves?
Well, I think the amplitude would be the actual height of the wave itself.
Sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah, so the height would be the amplitude. Yeah.
Right. Sure. And except that would be another unit of measure to measure water as opposed to sound.
Right. Okay.
Or the flow of water as opposed to sound. Yes, that's the same. Yes. Is it Grider? Ms. Grider? That's correct. Okay. Is there another question? Okay. It's going to really be important that you kind of keep that difference not only between the psychological or subjective judgment, but the difference between the physical measures. So let me know if you're still confused about amplitude versus cycles per second, or intensity versus frequency. I don't think I have any remaining animation. Okay, so it is possible for there to be ways to alter the frequency of a sound. And how many of you played an instrument? Okay, I'll do that, Susan. Okay, it's interesting. Decibel is just the unit of measure. And so when we measure, when we measure the intensity of the sound, we would record that measure in decibel. Okay, so perfect. We have guitar and a violin. Perfect. Okay, so there are ways that we can affect the frequency of sound. We can affect it by altering the length of the vibratory source. We can affect it by changing the mass of the source that's vibrating, or the stiffness of the vibratory source. So let's start with length. You guys may be too young, I don't know, or to remember swings that actually were chains, chain length. And so if you wanted to swing faster, you made the swing shorter. You made the chain length shorter. And so with the same pressure being applied, you would swing back and forth more cycles per second than if the strings of the swing were longer. Another analogy would be the difference between the frequency of a violin and the frequency of an upright bass. So with a violin, you have shorter strings that you set into vibration, and it produces more cycles per second. If you pluck the string, the chord of an upright bass, because it's much longer than the chords of a violin, it will produce less cycles per second. Let me think of another way, another thing. So the longer the vibratory body, the less cycles per second that it will move. If we apply the same force to a shorter vibratory source, it would oscillate more cycles per second. And so there's an inverse relationship. The longer, the less cycles per second. The shorter, the more cycles per second. You with me? Okay. Now, mass is the same. There is an inverse relationship. Let's go back to the swing. You have two. There is an adult on one swing. There is a toddler on the other. And we're going to apply the same force. Which will move with more cycles per second? The person with less mass or the adult with more mass? Colleen, you're correct. Okay, so the child, because there's less mass, but the same force applied, will swing more oscillations or cycles per second. The adult, because the adult is heavier with the same force being applied, will have less cycles per second. So the greater the mass, the less the frequency or cycles per second. The less mass, the greater the cycles per second. So that is also inverse, an inverse relationship. Okay, so just think about anytime you want something to move slower, you usually apply, or move less, you usually apply more mass. Let's look at stiffness and a guitar. So if our guitar string is fairly flaccid and we apply force and pluck the cord, it's going to move with less cycles per second. But if we tighten the cord and make it more stiff, apply the same force, the cord will oscillate more cycles per second. So the effect of stiffness on frequency has a direct relationship. Increased stiffness, increased frequency. Decreased stiffness, decreased frequency. Questions? So when you listen to, so yes, frequency is directly related to the note produced. Yes. And so instead of using hertz, we're referring to it as a note. But if I recorded the note and analyzed it for the number of cycles per second, I would record it in hertz. So when you are, if I was to record a 2-year-old, I think the CD would actually be the number of cycles per second of the whole thing, whereas the music on the CD, or what we're talking about, is the actual sound being produced by the CD, not the number of times that the CD is moving. Okay. Yes, I did say the longer string would move less cycles per second than tightening it. So think about if you asked a 2-year-old to say hot dog and an adult male to say hot dog. If I were to record the 2-year-old and analyze the frequency of that child's voice and then analyze the adult, the frequency of that adult's voice, the adult male would have a lower frequency, and we're going to talk about that fundamental frequency, than a 2-year-old. Why do you think that is? And so we said that the sound generator, or sound generation comes from your larynx or your vocal folds vibrating, correct? And so a 2-year-old will have shorter and thinner vocal folds, yes, length and mass, but more so mass. So less mass the 2-year-old will have than the adult male. And so that's why male voice sounds lower in frequency, or our perception would be pitch, than a child. And when males are going through adolescence and the vocal folds are lengthening, or are attempting to lengthen, that's when you hear breaks in pitch. for a male because it is increasing in mass and length. Does that make sense? Okay. So, on the exam, I may ask you, what are the effects of length on the frequency of the sound? What are the effects of mass on the frequency of sound? And so you will talk about the inverse relationship between length and mass on frequency. And if I ask you about stiffness, you're going to talk to me about the direct relationship, that as the vibratory body becomes more stiff, it will produce a higher frequency. Less stiff or more flaccid, it will produce a lower frequency. Okay. So far we've talked about the production of a sound. What about the detection or the reception of a sound? A normal, healthy human ear and brain can detect sound as low as 20 cycles per second and as high as 20,000 cycles per second. Anything around 20, or actually even lower, even higher, around 200 hertz, it's possible for you to feel the vibration. And so the vibrations are so low, they're audible by touch or audible by, it's a tactile sensation that you're detecting. And so when you hear or perceive an explosion, right, you're feeling it. You're feeling the cycles per second. When we're talking about speech, we only use the frequencies, or speech makes up the frequencies between 100 hertz and 5,000 hertz. So we're only looking at 250 hertz to 4,000 hertz in terms of those frequencies that make up the English language. So for instance, the sound, the S, will have a higher frequency or acoustical characteristic, so around 4,000 hertz, then the M would be lower in frequency, less cycles per second. So although, I'm sorry, Bradley? So although we can perceive up to 20,000 hertz, no problem, and as low as 20 hertz, we're only using frequencies between around 250 hertz and 4,000 hertz that make up the acoustical properties of speech. Now, our vocal folds, however, only vibrate as low for a male, 80 cycles per second, and for maybe a screaming child, 500 hertz per second. So the question is, where do those other frequencies come from? Where do they come from? And so we'll talk about that in a minute. This is just FYI. You don't have to memorize this. So if humans can detect sounds between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, but a dolphin can detect sound as high as over 100, let's say 150,000 hertz. And so that is why some animals are able to perceive sounds that we aren't able to perceive. Okay. This is really an inaccurate representation. So when you download this PowerPoint, put it in presentation, and click on the speaker, it will play a lower frequency sound. At the bottom, click on this speaker, it will play a higher frequency sound. But what's the problem with that? What's the problem with that depiction? It's not quite accurate based on what we just said about perception. So I arbitrarily just picked 6 hertz because I have 6 cycles per second. And I found an image that had 10 cycles per second. But the recordings I made could not have been of 6 hertz or 10 hertz because we couldn't perceive it, right? Anything under 20 hertz we can't perceive as humans. It will be there. There will be periods of compression and rarefaction, but our brains are not able to process that. So the old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there, will there still be sound? And the question is yes. So the tree falls. It disturbs air molecules as it hits the ground. It creates a sound. Now, whether we're there to receive those sound waves is a different story, but the sound still exists. Does that make sense? Okay, so a unit of measurement for intensity is that A hertz, B mil, C decibel for phone. Okay, C is correct, decibel. Which is true? As the vibratory or the vibrating source lengthens, the frequency decreases, or B, as the vibrating source increases, the mass. As the vibratory source increases in mass, the frequency increases, or C, as the vibrating source becomes more stiff, the frequency decreases. Which one? Okay, A. Correct. So as the vibratory source lengthens, so that upright bass produces a lower frequency sound than a shorter violin. Okay. Questions about that? Okay. Instrumentation that you will use as a speech-language pathologist. Now let me ask, I've never asked you guys that. Everyone that's registered for this course is hoping to be a speech-language pathologist. Is there anyone wanting to be an audiologist? Really? Okay, I've got one. Usually that's pretty rare. Okay. So, and by the way, I'm an audiologist, not a speech pathologist. So the instrumentation that a speech pathologist would use to analyze the acoustical production of their client or patient's voice, they would use the VisiPitch, which is now a computerized oscillator. And so if you look at this screen, it actually, no, that's not what I wanted to do. It actually depicts sine waves on the screen, and we can determine the frequency or the acoustical characteristics of speech. The young man, we can record his utterance, and hopefully he will be able to produce the target that we want him to produce, let's say a lower frequency utterance versus a higher frequency. And the visual feedback that he could get from the software used with the VisiPitch is the frog will hop to another lily pad if he gets that correct. So instead of showing the waveforms for a child, he would get that in a different visual representation. Now, for audiologists, we're more concerned about the reception of speech. And so we can measure how a person receives or detects frequencies and intensities by using an audiometer versus the busy pitch for a speech language pathologist. Okay. And for this class, you guys will be using Pratt, which is software that you can use to record speech. And for the laps that, I think it's laps 2, 3, and 4, you're recording your voice and making specific measurements about the frequency, the intensity, or maybe the timing of the speech production. Okay. Earlier we talked about complex tones. So far we've just been talking about pure tones, 1 cycle per second, or one swing swinging. When we speak, our vocal folds are vibrating, but they produce multiple frequencies. And so those complex tones are either periodic or aperiodic. Both have multiple frequencies, but a periodic sound with regard to speech, the periods of compression and rarefaction are repetitive in amplitude and they're repetitive in frequency. So for this you see multiple sine waves. There are actually 3, a blue one and 2 red ones. And there are multiple frequencies and multiple amplitudes, right? So it's a complex tone, but each wave repeats itself. They look weird, but each wave has the same pattern, okay? So there are 3 waves with different frequencies, different amplitudes, but they repeat themselves exactly over time. That is a periodic sound, and our vocal folds are able to produce vibrations or cycles per second, oscillations that repeat themselves exactly over time if they're healthy. So when we produce vowels, ah, oo, e, it's just we are listening to the sound being produced by our vocal folds and filtered by a vocal tract. Now, when we produce sounds like sh or s, our vocal folds aren't moving, and we're just producing noise. And so noise is aperiodic. Noise has multiple frequencies and intensities, but there's no repetition. So if you notice here, you've got multiple cycles per second, but they're all over the place. There's no repetition to it. And so when there's no repetition and the vibrations are random, then the sound is considered to be aperiodic, and we usually describe that as noise. And so there are some speech sounds where the production is strictly based on noise, either by obstructing the airflow, like with our teeth, or by holding a sound and releasing a puff of air like pah. That's just noise. And so there are some speech sounds that are aperiodic, and we call them voiceless because our vocal folds are not vibrating. And those are almost always consonants. Vowels are always periodic and are produced by our vocal folds vibrating. But it's also possible for us to produce a speech sound that has periodic components and aperiodic components. So if you were to produce the Z sound, your vocal folds are vibrating. You can put your hand over your throat where for a male where the Adam's apple would be. or the thyroid notch, and you can feel it vibrate. But you also are hearing noise being produced by obstructing the airflow by closing your teeth. And so those are called voiced consonants. So we're using our vocal folds to vibrate, but we're also producing an aperiodic sound. So let me get out of this. Yes.
So the z sound is an example of, if that would be considered periodic and aperiodic, just to confirm, I think that's what you said.
So the z or the zh, they're two different sounds. Both are voiced consonants. So they have a periodic signal because our vocal folds are vibrating, and we're producing noise in our oral cavity.
Got it. Okay.
So if we wanted to produce the z with just without noise, well, not without noise, but without a periodic component, it would be the S sound. And if you're touching the front of your throat, your vocal folds don't vibrate for the S, but they will for the Z. Questions about periodic production of sound with regard to speech and aperiodic production of sound? Yes. Yes. They're kind of in a category of their own, but yes. There's really not a way to produce a sound through your nose without vibration from your vocal folds. In fact, it's really weird. Those are called nasals. Okay, let's see. Folks, I'm going to leave phase out, but for the person that is thinking about audiology, let me say this. When the direction, not the direction, let's say if we have a wave that's beginning with rarefaction first and then compression, which would look like this, which would look like that, and we're also producing a sound where a wave starts with compression. If those waves are produced at the same time, you'll actually hear nothing. They will cancel themselves out because they're being produced out of phase. And you'll say, well, why would we want that? Well, it's actually happening in real time around us, but we can't see it. But there are times where we don't want there to be sound. And as audiologists, when people are attempting to listen to speech, particularly when their ears are compromised, it's easier for them to hear in quiet. And so there are times where we want to actually cancel noise out. Now, for phase, if you play or produce two sounds in phase, so they're starting at 0 degrees azimuth and moving in a positive manner, then the same frequency sounds will produce one tone with greater amplitude, and it's an additive type of process. And that would be the same as a band, right? You have one musical instrument playing the same note as another musical instrument, and if they're played at the same time, you have the same frequency or the same note, or frequencies on the same note, but it is actually more intense because there are two sounds being produced in the same phase with the same frequency. So, but that will not be on your test. Phase will not be there. Is that how Bose noise canceling? Yes. I'm not sure exactly how they're doing that digitally, but yes. Harmony would be different. Harmony is actually two different frequencies, or frequencies that are multiples of the first one. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But that analogy was using the same exact frequency. So that would be 2 hertz being played at the same time. You would still have the resulting sound would be 2 hertz, but just greater in amplitude. Okay, let's see. Which is not a periodic wave? This would be A, B, C, or D. Remember, it must, if it's not a periodic wave, then it will not repeat itself exactly. So, yes, D. So it looks weird. 4 looks weird, but it's not repetitive exactly. Okay, great. Okay, now, this is where harmony comes in, but it's kind of, it is possible for a vibrating body to produce an additional frequency that is a multiple of the originating frequency. So, the lowest frequency of a periodic wave is called the fundamental frequency. So, let's say that you are on a swing and the lowest number of cycles per second that it's possible for you to move with one exertion of force will be the fundamental frequency. Now, logically, a person with less mass will have a greater fundamental frequency. If you're applying the same force, it will naturally move more cycles per second. That's the fundamental frequency. Your vocal folds also have fundamental frequencies, meaning that based on the length and mass, they will vibrate. It is possible for them to vibrate at the lowest frequency possible, the lowest number of times possible. And so for longer, thicker vocal folds, they can vibrate at lower intensities naturally than shorter, thinner vocal folds. And that's called the fundamental frequency. So typically a male vocal folds will naturally vibrate at less cycles per second than a child's fundamental frequency or a female's fundamental frequency. How many of you sing? Okay. And so some of you may be soprano, some of you may be alto or tenor, bass, baritone. Okay. And that is really building on your fundamental frequency. So I'm a soprano. And so the fundamental frequency for me will be higher. I can't force my vocal folds to vibrate at a frequency, at a very low frequency like a tenor or a bass. My vocal folds are too thin, too short to vibrate that low. The same as a male who can sing bass cannot force his vocal folds to be thinner in order to produce a note that a soprano can sing. So that's one way of looking at the fundamental frequency, the number of times that your vocal folds can vibrate at its lowest cycles per second. Okay, are you with me? Okay. And that's just naturally. That's not with trying to apply additional force or trying to adjust your vocal folds to be thicker so that you would have a lower register. This is just the way you naturally speak with less effort. That's your fundamental frequency. Okay. Now, there are some individuals whose fundamental frequency may be abnormally high or abnormally low because of a disease process, right? So let's say that you're a professional singer and your vocal folds are constantly hitting each other. They can become swollen, and therefore they would have more mass. And so suddenly your voice sounds deeper or lower in frequency because your vocal folds are thicker because they have been abused and now they have edema. And so as a speech-language pathologist, you would work with that person to help them to not abuse their vocal folds. So you'll work with singers to keep them from abusing their vocal folds or developing nodules. Or you may work with a transgender person who wants to use a lower registry or a higher registry, depending on that. And so you're going to work on having them learn to adjust their vocal folds to kind of artificially produce a lower fundamental frequency. There are procedures that can tighten your vocal folds, or actually one of the muscles that tightens or lengthens your vocal folds, so that you will have a higher fundamental frequency without exerting force. And I've been meaning to look up the actual name of that procedure. So when you have a chance, this is showing you, let's see, to take a look at, let's see if I put this, it may work this way. Okay, so this, these are your vocal folds vibrating, and this is, we're threading a scope either down your nose or to the back of your throat, and it's so you're able to visualize your vocal folds vibrating. And if you notice, there's kind of a ripple, or it's kind of vibrating and touching in different places. So your vocal folds actually produce multiple tones, not just one. So this is actually, they're slowing this down because you really could not see this with the naked eye. Hold up. If the person is standing, are we looking up or down? So if the person is sitting or standing, we're looking down. So we're looking, so a scope can either be threaded through your nasal cavity down into your pharynx or your throat, and we're looking down your throat. Or we can put a camera, a rigid scope, and move it to the back of your throat through your mouth and shine the light down and record your vocal folds vibrating. Okay, so not only does your vocal folds produce the lowest natural rate that it vibrates, it also produces multiple frequencies that are actually a multiple of the fundamental frequency. So we're going to call the fundamental frequency the first harmonic. Okay, so let's say you are a male, and let's say you have a really, really low frequency, low fundamental frequency. Let's say it's 90 hertz. When your vocal fold vibrates and you're seeing those ripples or where it's touching in multiple places, it is producing additional sounds that are multiples of your fundamental. So for the second sound that it would produce would be 2 times the fundamental. So if the person's fundamental frequency is 90, the second sound or the second harmonic that it will produce will be 180, 2 times 90. The third would be 3 times 90. The fourth would be 4 times 90. And so yes.
So would you, if you were playing the guitar, would you get to the second harmonic by plucking the string with more force? Is that, in which case, how you would get to the second harmonic or third harmonic?
Well, if you're playing the guitar, if you pluck the string, the harder you pluck, the higher the amplitude, so it would be how intense the sound would be. In order to produce the second harmonic, you're going to put pressure in the middle of that same string so that when you pluck it, it's now vibrating in 2 different places. And so that's what you see here. So if we're plucking this, so if this is one string here, right, and we pluck it, it's vibrating. But if we want it to produce 2 frequencies, which are multiples of the first, we're going to put our finger here, then strike the chord, and now we have vibrations here and vibrations here. And these are multiples of this one. So let's say that the first harmonic or the first chord, lowest vibration would be 100 hertz. So if we put our finger pressure between separating the chord into 2 equal areas, then we're now producing the second harmonic would be 2 times 100, which would be 200 hertz. If we separated the original chord into 3 separate areas, it would be 3 times 100, which would be 300 hertz, and on and on. And so the way to play or to create harmonics on a guitar is when you place your fingers separating or creating multiple areas of vibration with your fingers. But your vocal folds, when they're vibrating, they're producing, by the nature of the way they vibrate, not only are they vibrating with the lowest frequency or lowest repetition possible, but it's also producing additional frequencies that are multiples of the fundamental frequency. Questions? Okay, would somebody, Bradley, would you raise your hand so you can hear that tone? Can everyone hear that tone? Okay, that's one frequency. Now, when we speak, we don't sound like beeps. We don't sound like a bell. Boop. We don't sound like a note. when we speak ah, you're hearing many, many frequencies. And so when I produce the vowel ah, my vocal folds are vibrating, but they're vibrating multiple tones. They're vibrating multiples of my fundamental frequency, and I think my fundamental frequency is like 250. And so with each harmonic, it will be 2 times 250. And so remember, our vocal folds produce, speech is made up of multiple tones or complex tones. And your vocal folds are producing multiple tones. And those tones are multiples of the fundamental frequency. Questions? Okay, let's say we wanted to record the production or the production of your vocal folds vibration. We can do it using a line spectrogram. So instead of sine waves, they're represented by lines. We have frequency across the x-axis and amplitude or intensity representing the y. The first line is your fundamental frequency or your first harmonic. It is always going to be the loudest and the lowest. But each remaining, that's your second fundamental, your second harmonic, your third, your fourth, your fifth, and they're always multiples of the first. And so your vocal folds are actually capable of producing not only your fundamental frequency, but up to 3,500 frequencies, or 3,499 harmonics. Or we can depict it as instead of lines, but with cycles per second. So this is your fundamental frequency, and these are your harmonics. This is a line spectrogram. This is another line spectrogram. And this is a continuous spectrogram. This time, frequency is on the y-axis. And the only thing we have on the x is time, how long it takes for that production. So the question is, where is intensity? Intensity, instead of the height of the line, is how dark the striation is. This is a continuous spectrogram. This is a line spectrogram of vocal fold production. And so this would be the fundamental frequency, this one. Well, that's kind of hard to see. Let's just call this the first one. And these are the harmonics. Let me go back up. Okay, so the lowest rate of a sound's vibration is what? Great, the fundamental frequency. Okay, guys. My philosophy over 20 25 years, 26 years of teaching, is to give you as much as I think you can work with, and not allow my course outline to dictate how fast I'm giving you the information. And so I'm going to postpone the acoustics exam until the next week and continue this lecture next week, because it's really, really important that you get this information. So rushing through this and just testing you on it will not be helpful, because if you don't get the basics, you'll not understand anything else that we're talking about. So you'll take an exam this week over the preface and the anatomical terms. Next Monday, we'll review the beginning of this lecture and complete it. If we have time, we can start respiratory anatomy, but I'm not going to be pressured by a course outline. But on the other hand, I need for you to study. I need for you to look at this stuff every day. Write down questions and bring those questions back to me. I can't, although I can talk to you, I can show you videos, PowerPoints, I cannot pour the knowledge in your head. The only way you can learn this is to study. And if you have concerns about how to study, we can meet individually and talk individually, and I can help you with that. So I'm going to stop here. You've listened to me for 2 hours, and that's much longer than most adults can do without, not being able to kind of digest the information. So we will continue next Monday on acoustics, and you will only be responsible for the first quiz for this upcoming weekend. Questions? Okay. Please look at the links to the videos I have embedded in the PowerPoint. Hopefully it'll give you time to receive your text in the mail. It'll give you time to read. But please study. If you have questions, you can shoot them to me via email. I'll be happy to respond. No problem. It only works if you're studying. And I know it seems like a lot of information, and yes, it is a lot of information. But if you're not studying every day, I cannot emphasize that, your outcome will not be what you want. And this course is just, an undergraduate course. You'll have speech science, acoustics, anatomy on the graduate level in more detail. Okay, Pally, I'll take a look at that. Okay, this is, I think actually the lockdown browser is to make instructors feel better. It's preventing you from searching the web looking for answers to the quiz on the same computer. I am not naive. If you want to cheat, there are multiple ways of you doing that. With your telephone, with whether you're browsing on your phone or calling someone on the phone, there's multiple ways of doing it. I'm going to take the browser off. I'm sort of over that. But believe me, if you choose to be dishonest, it will catch up with you later. So I will remove the browser until I figure out kind of what's going on. You are all adults, and I'm all assuming that you want to learn, and that you want to perform well enough to get into graduate school in order to be a competent SLP. Okay, no problem. Questions? Let's see. Your discussion is already open. It will be locked on June 18th. Let me put this in student view. Okay. Oops. Yeah, so you have until the 18th to complete both discussion questions on respiration. There are two. So one is, so you'll have two per system. So you'll have to answer for each one, but you're also making an original post and then commenting on another student's post. So before the 18th, you're going to post 4 times. Does that make sense? You have 2 different questions, and you're going to comment on your classmates' answer, just one, to the different questions. And so before the end of the semester, you have 5 discussion questions that you're being graded on, and so there should be a total of 10 posts. Any other questions? Let me get back to okay. All right, folks, if there are no other my finals